He thought he could bully a young girl until he learned her grandfather was Morgan Freeman. The streets of New Orleans were alive with the golden hues of sunset, but for 15-year-old Chloe Freeman, the day was far from peaceful. The flashing red and blue lights behind her sent a chill down her spine. "Hands where I can see them." She froze. A routine walk home had just turned into a nightmare. Does respect come from power or character? Comment 1 for character, 0 for power. Chloe Freeman had never been in trouble. She had never stolen anything, never caused a scene. She followed the rules because that's how her grandfather, Morgan Freeman, had raised her. So when the police cruiser pulled up beside her, tires screeching against the pavement, she had no reason to be afraid until she looked into the officer's eyes. There was no kindness there, no concern, just suspicion. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Grant barked, stepping out of the car, his hand hovering near his holster. Chloe blinked. I live here," she stammered, pointing down the street. The officer scoffed. "Right, and I'm supposed to believe that?" The second officer, a younger man, shifted uneasily but said nothing. Chloe reached for her phone. "I need to call my grandfa—" A rough hand snatched her wrist. Her breath caught. "Not another move," Grant growled. "I don't know what you're hiding, but you're coming with us." Panic surged in Chloe's chest. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing in the wrong place. Her fingers clenched around the only lifeline she had left. She pressed one button. A single call. To the one person who could fix this. And when Morgan Freeman arrived, Officer Grant would realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The grip on Chloe Freeman's wrist tightened, her pulse pounding beneath Officer Grant's fingers. "You're coming with us," he repeated, his voice a sharp contrast to the fading warmth of the New Orleans sunset. Chloe's breath hitched. "I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice stronger now, fueled by a mix of confusion and anger. Grant scoffed. "That's what they all say," he muttered, yanking her forward. The younger officer hesitated, shifting on his feet, his gaze flickering between Grant and the girl. "Sir, maybe we should—" Grant shot him a glare. "You questioning me, rookie?" The younger cop clamped his mouth shut. Chloe was alone, or at least she would have been, if not for the call still ringing in her pocket. Chloe could barely move, but her fingers had done the work for her. The second officer Grant had grabbed her, she had pressed the emergency dial. And the name that flashed on the screen? Morgan Freeman. She didn't know if he'd answer. She didn't know if he'd even see it in time. But as the police car door swung open and Grant tried to shove her inside, the sound of a deep, unmistakable voice rang through the speaker. "Chloe?" The room froze. The young officer's eyes widened. "Grant?" Grant just laughed. "Who's this?" "Daddy coming to save you," he mocked, snatching the phone from Chloe's hands. The voice on the other end didn't waver. "This is Morgan Freeman," he said, his tone even, steady, yet carrying a weight that sent a shiver down Chloe's spine. Grant hesitated, the color in his face shifting just slightly. "And who the hell is Morgan Freeman?" Chloe blinked. The younger officer inhaled sharply, and then from behind them a black SUV rolled to a stop. The door swung open, and Morgan Freeman stepped out. A hush fell over the street. Pedestrians slowed, a few cars pulled over. People recognized the man who had just arrived, but Morgan Freeman wasn't here as a celebrity today. He wasn't here as the Hollywood legend, the Oscar-winning actor, the man with a voice that could make history itself stand still. He was here as a grandfather, and right now, nothing else mattered. His eyes found Chloe immediately, scanning her face for injury. A red mark, bruising on her wrist. That was enough. Grant, however, was still grinning. "Well, well," he sneered, tossing the phone back to Chloe. "Look who decided to show up." Morgan didn't blink. "I suggest you let my granddaughter go." Grant's smirk widened. "Or what?" he taunted. "You gonna narrate my life story at me?" The younger officer visibly paled. because unlike his partner, he knew exactly who they were dealing with. But Grant? Grant had no idea that he had just made the second biggest mistake of his life. Morgan took a step forward, the air around him shifting. "You didn't answer my question," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "Why is my granddaughter in handcuffs?" Grant snorted. "Because she was loitering." "Loitering?" Morgan repeated, his tone like a blade slicing through the space between them. "In front of her own house?" Grant hesitated, just for a moment. But that moment was enough. The spell was broken. People were watching now. Phones were out. A video had already gone live, and Morgan Freeman knew exactly how this was going to end. Grant just hadn't figured it out yet. "Listen, old man," Grant finally snapped, frustration bleeding into his voice. "I don't care who you are. The girl was acting suspicious. That's all I need to know." Morgan inhaled slowly, letting the words settle. And then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. "You don't know who I am, Officer Grant?" Grant rolled his eyes. "Should I?" The younger officer took a step back. "Oh, man," he muttered under his breath. "You're done." But Grant? Grant still thought he had the upper hand, and that was his final mistake. The next thing Morgan Freeman said made Officer Grant's entire world collapse. Officer Grant squared his shoulders, still holding on to the illusion of control. The badge on his chest gleamed under the dimming sunset, but in the presence of Morgan Freeman, it suddenly seemed much smaller. "You don't know who I am?" Morgan repeated, his voice calm, deliberate. Grant scoffed. "I don't care who you are." A muscle in Morgan's jaw tightened. "Then that," he said slowly, "is your first mistake." A hush fell over the crowd that had gathered. The younger officer exchanged an uneasy glance with Grant, but his partner was still too arrogant to notice the shift in power. Chloe, still standing in the shadow of her grandfather, could feel it. The air had changed. And Grant? He was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Morgan took another step forward, closing the space between them. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice unwavering. "I've spent my life telling stories. Stories that shape the way people see the world. Stories that expose the truth." He gestured toward the crowd of bystanders, many of whom had their phones raised, recording. "And today, Officer Grant, the story is about you." Grant frowned, glancing at the cameras for the first time. Then his smirk faltered. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. "This isn't a big deal," he muttered. "She was acting suspicious. I was doing my job." Morgan's gaze darkened. "You assaulted my granddaughter." The weight of the words hung in the air. Grant shifted uncomfortably. She reached for something I didn't know." "She reached for her phone," Morgan cut in, his voice suddenly sharper. "Because she was scared. Because she knew what was coming before you even did it." Grant's jaw clenched. He could feel control slipping from his grasp. The younger officer, standing rigid beside Grant, suddenly took a breath and stepped forward. "Sir," he addressed Morgan, his voice cautious but respectful, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Grant's head snapped toward his partner. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. But the younger cop had seen enough. He had seen the fear in Chloe's eyes. He had seen how Grant had escalated the situation when there had never been a threat to begin with. And now, he wasn't going down with him. Morgan turned toward the younger officer, giving him a slow nod of acknowledgement. "You see it, don't you?" he said. "You see what's wrong here?" The officer hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." Grant was seething. "You can't be serious," he snapped. "Are you taking his side?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "His side?" he echoed. "Officer Grant, let me make something very clear." He straightened to his full height, the authority in his presence more powerful than any badge or uniform. There are no sides when the truth is staring you in the face. Grant opened his mouth to argue, to deflect, to grasp at the last thread of control he thought he had, but he never got the chance, because at that moment another police vehicle pulled up, and out stepped their commanding officer. Captain Reynolds was a no-nonsense veteran, the kind of officer who had seen and heard everything. The second his eyes landed on Morgan Freeman, they widened in alarm. Then they narrowed at Grant. "What the hell is going on here?" Reynolds demanded. The crowd parted, revealing Chloe, still shaken, her wrist bruised from Grant's grip. Then the cameras turned. The videos were still rolling. Reynolds' expression darkened. "Tell me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "did you just lay hands on Morgan Freeman's granddaughter?" Grant finally realized just how badly he had screwed up. "Sir, Not another word," Reynolds snapped. "Badge, now?" Grant's entire body locked up. "Sir, I said now." The younger officer stepped back, watching in stunned silence as Grant, trembling with rage and disbelief, unpinned his badge and held it out. Morgan Freeman watched, saying nothing, because he didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. But just as Grant thought his humiliation was over, Morgan turned to him with one last lesson to deliver. Officer Grant's fingers trembled as he unpinned his badge. He had spent years using that small piece of metal as a shield, a weapon, a symbol of control. But in front of Morgan Freeman, in front of the rolling cameras, in front of a crowd that now saw him for exactly what he was, it meant nothing. Captain Reynolds snatched the badge from Grant's hand, his expression cold. "I don't know what the hell you were thinking," Reynolds said, his voice laced with barely controlled fury. "But you just put this entire department in a situation we may never recover from." Grant opened his mouth, grasping at an excuse, anything to salvage the authority that was slipping from his grip. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Morgan's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Your job was to serve and protect." His eyes, dark and unwavering, held Grant in place. "Tell me," he said slowly, "who were you protecting when you grabbed my granddaughter?" The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Grant swallowed hard. He looked at Chloe, standing beside her grandfather, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her cheek was still red from where he had grabbed her. Her wrist still bore the bruise of his grip. And in her eyes, fear had turned to something else, defiance. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even trembling anymore. She was watching him, studying him, learning from him, and that realization hit him harder than any punishment ever could. He had become exactly the kind of man he had sworn he wasn't. Grant started. But what could he say? That he hadn't meant to? That it was just a mistake? The damage had already been done, and Morgan Freeman was about to make sure he understood just how deep that damage went. Morgan took a slow step forward, his presence calm, steady, but carrying the weight of something far greater than anger. "Let me tell you a story," he said. The entire street went still. Grant didn't dare move. Even Captain Reynolds and the younger officer stood frozen, waiting. Because when Morgan Freeman speaks, the world listens. "When I was a young man," Morgan began, "I learned that power is a dangerous thing. The man who carries a weapon but does not understand its weight is more dangerous than any criminal." His gaze never wavered. "And a man who wears a badge but does not understand his duty is more dangerous than any outlaw." Grant's breathing was shallow now, because for the first time he was seeing himself through someone else's eyes. Through Morgan Freeman's eyes, and it was a damning reflection. Morgan slowly gestured to the crowd. "You see these people?" he asked. "They are not afraid of you because you are a protector." He took another step closer. "They are afraid of you because you are not." Grant flinched. "And that," Morgan continued, "that is your real failure." The weight of his words settled over the entire street. The younger officer, still standing to the side, lowered his gaze. Captain Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. And the people filming? They weren't just recording anymore. They were witnessing history. Because tonight, Morgan Freeman hadn't just exposed one corrupt cop. He had exposed the entire system that allowed men like Grant to exist. Grant knew it, and for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. Not of Morgan Freeman, not of losing his badge, but of what came next. Because Morgan Freeman wasn't just here to teach him a lesson. He was about to make sure the whole world heard it. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Officer Grant stood there, his badge gone, his authority shattered, not by force, but by truth. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. He had spent years using his position to intimidate, to demand respect through fear. But now, standing in front of Morgan Freeman, a man who commanded respect without ever having to raise his voice, he finally understood. Respect is not given because of a uniform. It is earned through character. And he had failed that test. Grant swallowed hard, his gaze flickering to Chloe, who stood beside her grandfather, unwavering. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was watching him, waiting. And in that moment, Grant realized something worse than losing his badge. He had become the very thing he once swore he wasn't. A bully, a coward, a man who had mistaken power for worth. Morgan took a step forward, his voice soft but firm. "You have a choice, Officer Grant." Grant met his gaze. "You can continue down this road," Morgan said, "or you can learn from this. Because today, you were humbled, and tomorrow the world will remember." The cameras were still rolling. The world was still watching. Grant lowered his head. He had already made one mistake too many. Because when Morgan Freeman speaks, history listens, and some mistakes can never be undone. Through this story, we realize that power does not grant respect. Character does. Morgan Freeman did not need force to correct an injustice. He used wisdom, dignity, and truth. Too often, we assume that authority justifies actions, that titles equal worth. But real leadership is not about demanding respect. It is about earning it through how we treat others, especially those we believe to be powerless. The greatest test of a person is not how they behave when they are in charge, but how they act when they believe no one is watching. And in the end, the world is always watching.